Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming to tonight's class. Tonight it's Business Awareness Revision, which is the new paper, of course, that's brand new for the new Quals 22 Level 3. Last week we started working through Mock 1, which it's a 20-mark question in the exam. So task 1 is 20 marks, so it's half an hour. So it's a substantial task. It's quite a big part of the exam. We looked at parts A and B, I think, last week, and we're carrying on from that now. So without further ado, let's look at the next topic, which is the ethical code for accountants. Now, professional ethics is nothing new to AAT. This is something that we looked at previously as part of the synoptic unit, and prior to that it used to be a freestanding unit all on its own. Now it's a part of the business awareness unit, and we'll look at the other areas that this unit covers a bit further on. Here we got a brief summary of what the ethical code for accountants covers, and essentially the bits we have to learn are the 5 principles. So we have 5 principles and a range of threats, and most of the threats will kind of relate to one or more of the principles. And the important thing to remember first and foremost about the AAT, or the ethical code for accountants, is it is not a list of rules. You don't have a great list of rules with every possible situation covered where you can go, oh, situation number 28, client offers me some money to turn a blind eye to some dodgy transactions. Solution, we don't have a set rule. What we have are guidelines, which means 2 things. One is we've got really the freedom to think about what course of action is correct. And secondly, it does mean there's lots of grey areas. In most cases, your common sense will be your best guide with any question involving principles. I find that often we can associate key words. So if we look at the first principle is integrity. Integrity, a person with integrity is someone we can trust. Someone who does the right thing. Some keywords. In a situation, the sort of things that are a threat to integrity, any suggestion of personal gain. And that might be, an offer of something nice, or it could be a threat. And we've listed under threats, intimidation and self-interest. So an example of a self-interest threat, what I mentioned a minute ago, self-interest might be the client says, well, I've got a lovely restaurant here. Why don't you bring all your family for a do at Christmas? I'll treat you all to a fabulous 5-course meal, and don't worry about the £500 bill because you do such a good job in my account. In return, could we perhaps say nothing about that problem invoice that you flagged up the other day? So self-interest, might be a reward for wrongdoing. Something like that that comes up in a question is going to be fairly obvious. Intimidation, a more typical example of an intimidation threat that we might be asked about in an assessment, will invariably involve either the boss. So the boss says to you, I don't care that you're not very good on tax. We need to get this tax return in and done, and there isn't anybody to help. You'll just have to do it. Don't forget your annual review is due. You know, and you wouldn't want me to have the impression that you're not very good at what you do. There's anything where the boss is putting pressure on is an intimidation threat. The other person from whom an intimidation threat might come could be a client. If we have a situation where a practice is reliant on a particular client for a large part of its income, then again, that client could say, well, you know, I think we need to look at my figures again because my tax bill is going to be too high. You know, and if you're not prepared to do it, I'll have to find somebody who is prepared to do it, which is, you know, sounds a bit far-fetched. I actually worked with somebody a few years back who'd had the problem with the boss. Without going into too much detail and revealing who it was and where, this was an organization that employed a range of people, mostly to do with processing of fish. And at the time, there were EU grants available if you employed a certain level of people from certain backgrounds. And the chap I knew was presented with some EU grant application forms, which had various claims on them that were not true. That, you know, he was basically trying to claim EU funding for employing people that weren't there. I think he was disguising people who were there as being other than as they were. And my colleague at the time, this was before I worked with him, he actually said, you know, I'm not going to do that. And I won't say exactly what the person in charge said to him, but it was along the lines of, if you want to stay here, you'll do as I say. And he actually did have to leave the job. And that's somebody I admire greatly, because here's one thing to remember. In an AAT exam, it's very easy to say you would have to resign your position. That's a very difficult thing to do in real life. But he did that, and it worked out well, because I worked alongside him for a number of years after that at another organization, and we got on all right. So these things do really happen. You know, sometimes it's tempting to look at ethics scenarios that we get in exams thinking, well, that's all well and good, but that couldn't happen. But that one really did. So intimidation, you're looking for any kind of pressure. And remember always, it's not pressure to do the right thing. It's when it's pressure to do the wrong thing. So, for example, you can offer sales staff a bonus for achieving targets. And that's not a threat, because achieving targets, as long as it's done correctly, is not a bad thing. This is all when the pressure is to do the wrong thing. And generally, the thing that we as accountants would be pressurized to do would be to present misleading information, because ultimately we're in the business of generating information. Now, the second principle, objectivity, is easily confused with integrity, because both of them involve following a course of action that isn't appropriate for the facts as they are. Now, integrity, the course of action is because perhaps you've something to gain, as I've mentioned, you know, something to gain by it. Objectivity, it might be the wrong course of action because of something you believe. Notice two of the same threats appear: intimidation and self-interest. So again, you may have something to gain. So to an extent, in objectivity often will occur at the same, the same type of threat will affect both. A self-review threat arises when you are looking over something that you did sometime previously and you realize you made a mistake. And it's very tempting in that situation to say nothing, just to obfuscate, just to let it leave it as it is. So the correct thing to do if you find you have made a mistake previously is to put it right. Of course, if If you don't, that's because of a self-review threat. Now, an advocacy threat. The word to remember here, an advocate, is another word for a lawyer. Integrity gain, objectivity loss, maybe. But again, if somebody threatens to take something away, that can still be a threat to integrity. Advocacy threat, an advocate is an old name for a lawyer, a person who speaks up for someone else. So if you are seen to be supporting a point of view, a client, then, if it's as if you're maybe a client says, can you come and talk to the bank for me? Tell them what a brilliant business we've got and how well we do everything. You'd have to be very careful not to do that. You can present figures, you can present information that speaks for itself. What you mustn't do is say, this is a great business, they do a good job, they're lovely people. And most of us have got something in life that we're passionate about. Some people are passionate about their football. I'm a bit of an environmental nutcase, and I have to try not to bang on at people about energy and renewables and electric cars and things. We've all got something that we care about. So we've always got to be on the lookout for letting our own personal beliefs and opinions start to influence. Oh, look, this company, one or two things and figures are a bit dodgy, but they do renewables. They're really good people trying to save the planet. Can we make it look a bit better for them? Or here are the books for a coal mine. I don't like them. They're doing all this damage. Well, if we look on the black side, anything, any threat to the truth of the matter is a threat to objectivity. Professional competence. This is anything to do that affects the quality of the work. So obvious ones are, have you got the skills? Who can give me another example of a factor that might affect the quality of the job that somebody does? Oh, is the sound a little bit quiet? Oh, well, that was advocacy. Sorry. Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, knowledge. Yep, agreed. You could be very capable, but if it's about tax and you've not really studied tax, experience. Yeah. What about if you are you're really good at all of those, you're brilliant at your job, you've got the qualifications, you keep up to date with your professional development, it's something you've worked on before. What situation might you be put in that could still compromise the quality of your work? Here's a clue. I've got a clock up there. Overload, yes, if you've got too much to do in the time available. Time pressure, excellent. The most capable person in the world, if they're not given sufficient time. So any of those things that you see, they're all pointers to professional competence. And do you care? Again, do you care if you've got to rush, if you're given a job that should really take 3 hours and it's sort of a Friday afternoon, it's 4 o'clock and you've got to be somewhere at 5:30. So any of those, if you see any implication that one of those is under threat, that's competence and do you care? Okay, confidentiality. Well, this one we should always spot. But again, the nuance was it's pretty obvious. Client records got to be kept out of sight. Computers need passwords. There are times when we can disclose and when we must. So confidentiality isn't only about knowing what we must not disclose, but also you quite like to get asked about what you can. So if we have a legal duty, if we are summoned to a court of law, then the requirement to disclose information overrides confidentiality. The one thing that we will meet, as well as the code, the thing that links into it, the money laundering regulations place a legal requirement on us to report what we think are suspicious activities. Secondly, if there is if the professional body is investigating, there's perhaps there's been a complaint against a member, so the professional body can require us to reveal what information that would otherwise be confidential. And of course, that the thing to know there is that that information won't leave the professional body, so it's not going to be disclosed for all the world to see. It is going to remain confidential because the professional body itself is bound by a duty of confidentiality. And of course, the third time that information can be disclosed, when can we disclose information? Nothing to do with the law or the AAT. Ever such an obvious one. When might the client be happy for us to disclose information? Written authorization? Yeah, excellent. With permission. And excellent, good point, Sashin. Best to get that in writing for obvious reasons. So again, it's not only the easy part of confidentiality questions is knowing when you can't disclose. The tricky bits are knowing when you can and must. And then the last one, got a good story about this one. Professional behavior. We like to think that the profession is held in some esteem. You know, we like to think the profession has a good reputation and we must keep it that way. So anything that discredits the profession. So this is often not only at work. So if it's been a busy Friday at week and a few folks say, oh, let's stop off on the way home for a bit of a drink, and it all gets a bit raucous, all a bit loud, and it just so happens that an important client or somebody who just happens to know where you all work sees what's going on, you know, so it really is about behavior. A true story. Someone who worked for a firm for whom I had done some training a few years back was sitting in an airport departure lounge, and there was a delay, and one flight got cancelled and held up. And somewhat humorously, after a period of time, he put on Facebook, that's it. If I'm here another 30 minutes, I'm going to blow up the airport, or words to that effect. And I put a bomb under this airport. And you think, what a silly thing to put on Facebook. Ha! Within 11 minutes, he was in the back of a police van in handcuffs. Never did get on his holiday, ended up on criminal charges, and lost his job. So, and that was a bit of an example of breaching professional behavior. So if your plane is ever late at an airport, don't humorously put on Facebook that you're going to blow the place up in another half hour. There's a good takeaway from tonight for you. True story. So professional behavior is not only at work, and it is, you know, act as if people are watching. When it comes to at work, we use this expression, professional skepticism. There's a very popular saying when you see things on offer for sale on the internet. They just seem too good to be true. And the truth is, they usually are. So again, when we're presented with information about a business, wow, this business has got sales of £800,000. The goods that they've sold only cost them 50,000. They've got a 95% gross profit margin. Is that very likely? Could it be perhaps that some of those figures are being manipulated to hide the fact that cash is coming in through the back door? So, the key word we're looking for is reasonable. And this, I'm not sure that we're going to get an exam question that might relate to this. But whenever you're looking at sets of figures, always ask yourself, do they look reasonable? And if not, why might the figures look the way they do? Okay, moving on. Ethical conflicts. Situations arise where we are between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Particularly here it says, if we take on two competing clients, then safeguards have to be put in place. Typically, this will be separate teams. And checking that the clients do not mind. What you must not really have is the same person working on figures for two competing clients. Again, we've mentioned about objectivity. If you have strong opinions about something, again, that could be tricky. What if there was a time when nobody would do business with companies in South Africa, and thankfully that has moved on now that South Africa is a multiracial society. At one time, in the days of apartheid, it was heavily segregated and it really was a frowned on country. But some businesses still worked with South African businesses. So, you could, as an individual, if you were in that position, I don't know, maybe in practice and your business takes on a friend of, not wanting to be too political, friend of Mr. Putin, perhaps, you might not want to work on that. So, okay. Other conflicts, accepting gifts or hospitality. This really is a pointer to threat to integrity, objectivity, or integrity. If we're offered something very nice, then if we're offered something very nice in recognition for providing services, again, the key word here for gifts is reasonable. Okay, bottle of wine at Christmas to say, thank you for getting all my figures in on time, and thank you for sorting out that mess that my VAT return had got into before you did it. Thank you for sorting that out. Here's a nice bottle of wine. That's not unreasonable. But again, if you can get my tax return and my tax bill is going to be less than this amount, well, we're not using the holiday cottage for a fortnight. Next month, you might like to take a few days away. Is it reasonable? Is it reasonable? Okay, moving on. Now, moving on now to legislation. It can happen that in the course of our work, we discover unethical behavior. The example quoted here is an error or omission in a tax return. Clients got receipts of £100,000 or not receipts. You happen to know that a client has just been involved in promoting a music festival and you happen to know that 15,000 people turned up and the average ticket price was £20. 15,000 times 20, £300,000. And yet, in the books of account that you're given, his takings are only recorded as 50,000 or 100,000. First thing you must do, advise the client, because it could be a genuine error. We all make mistakes. Could simply be a genuine error. Might not be an error. There might be, okay, if it's not as obvious as the example I just quoted, you might say, your sales look a bit low, and he might say, oh, well, we had a flood, the shop was closed for 8 months, we've only got 4 months takings this year, that's why it's a lot less than last year. That's possible. So it could be genuine error or even not an error. If it's a genuine error, it could be corrected. And if the client corrects it, fair enough. We all make mistakes. I know I do. So if it's corrected, and if it's already gone in and the client contacts the Revenue and Customs, puts it straight, fine. But if the client refuses to put it right, and the client says, I don't care what you say, just, I've given you the paperwork, you've worked out the figures, live with it. And this all sounds ridiculous, but I've got another story about this. Then something has to be done. And first and foremost, we would have to cease to act. Wrong colour. On Cleethorpes seafront, this isn't a public domain, so I'm not breaching any confidentialities. There is a chip shop called the Seaway. The owner of which said premises is currently residing, courtesy of His Majesty now, or might be out by now. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And the report that was published locally was that his accountants had not been happy with the figures that was on his VAT return, figures that he'd been entering, and they had advised the client, and he had told them that he was happy, it was all correct, and he wasn't prepared to change anything. And this was the report that said he had been told by his accountants. So of course, what then had happened, they'd had to report it, not telling him they were reporting, but they had to report it. And when he was investigated, he struggled to explain how he had bought a property for £650,000 in cash, and also why he was keeping another 60,000 in a suitcase in a wardrobe. And the irony was, I was interested in the case because the house that he bought was my old boss that I'd worked for previously. So I knew that I'd been in that house. I knew the house. So he'd been told by his accountants that something did not look right, refused to do anything about it, and hey presto. Intriguingly, that chip shop still has a sign in the window that says cash only. Make of that what you will. So we've got a client, we're not happy with the figures, it's pretty obvious something is not right. First and foremost, say, look, we're sorry, if we don't think your figures are right, we are not permitted to work for somebody whom we believe to be dishonest. That is all we must say. What we must then do is, now be careful with the wording here, we have to report the client's refusal to disclose. We don't report it to HMRC, we report it to the National Crime Agency. And the key word is, we must report, it only has to be suspicion. We don't have to have cast iron evidence. That's not our job. If we have a suspicion that things don't seem right, it must be a reasonable suspicion. Let's maybe add that word, reasonable suspicion. So we've got to report to the National Crime Agency. They will review and they will decide and they will investigate properly to decide if they think there's a case to answer or if it's just something that Right. Notice that our obligation to report only arises if this was discovered because as part of the course of our working for the client. If we did not work for that client, if we weren't working for them, and perhaps we hear two people talking on the bus, as people do, you know, if we hear something socially, oh, have you heard so-and-so's got £50,000 in a suitcase in his wardrobe? That's, you know, we're not obliged to act. There's no obligation in respect of people that we don't do work for. So the obligation is if it comes about during the course of work we are doing for a client. So again, read questions carefully to make sure that if you're told of information that's come to light, how it has come to light is relevant. So no obligation if they didn't act. You can still note, you can still report, but there's no obligation. So obligation if we know or suspect or have reasonable grounds, say reasonable suspicion. If they're engaged in money laundering, which is the process of making criminal money received through criminal activity, making it appear legitimate. And there are three offences. First offence is money laundering. And there are two more offences that we need to make sure we know about. Number two is, and it says here, failure to disclose. That's the second offence. And the third offence is tipping off. And what that means is we must not tell the client. So we can tell the client that we'll cease to act. We must not, under any circumstances, say, because we're going to go to the NCA, you're going to be in trouble. We must not, because of course, otherwise the accountant will have a suspicious fire in his back office. And, you know, these are all things that have happened. So vital that we know that. Okay, so moving on. Here we go. Here's an example of the sort of question that we might be asked. Apologies if I pronounce this wrong to anybody who knows better. Shazia is an accountant in practice. She's been asked to prepare the financial statements from source records and be heavily involved in the so she's going to prepare the financial statements and be involved in the year-end audit. So she's going to do the work, and then she's going to be involved in checking the work. So pick list gap 1, the type of threat: intimidation, self-review, advocacy. Any offers? Anybody want to? Go on in. Yeah, looking good, looking good. Yep, it is indeed. Self-review threat. She's going to be checking her own work. Checking own work. And this is a threat to. So let's think. Objectivity. Is it going to be anything other than the facts of the matter that are going to sway her? Integrity. Does she have anything to gain? Confidentiality. Will anybody find something that they shouldn't know about? To be honest, there really are two here that are affected, because plainly she's going to be influenced by the fact if she finds she's made a mistake, she may not want to admit it. She doesn't want to appear incompetent to her peers, which would be in integrity in her own self-interest might come into it. Generally, the standard answer to a question like this is objectivity, because she's not necessarily got anything specific to gain or lose. So she'd be influenced by the fact that she doesn't want to admit, to a mistake. So objectivity, but what that question does illustrate really is that integrity and objectivity, they really are very often, the line between them is very blurred, Shazia has been asked by a friend to supply a character reference for one of their relatives, which indicates that they have strong financial acumen. The family member is unknown to Shazia, and she's also heard that they're currently facing financial difficulty. So someone she doesn't know, except that she's heard that they're not too hot with money, somebody has asked her to sign a document that she can be trusted. Well, what I can't see here, I can't see any offer for I can't see any personal gain being offered. So can't see any of that. Okay. There's no indication that she doesn't know what she's doing, or that she's got to do it in a hurry or whatever. So I don't see any issue for professional competence. And because of the gain, integrity, well, if it said she'd been offered something, but I can't see she has. Confidentiality, well, the reference would presumably be only passed to a very specific individual, and it's not something she's going to tell everybody about. Again, there's no sign there of information being released. And yep, I'm in agreement with Sashi, indeed. Professional behavior. Yeah, she says she'll sign anything. She's all right. You know what those accountants are like. Yeah, just stick it in front of her. She'll sign it. Notice the approach to a multi-choice question. Look for the really weak options and rule out as many as you can. And often you'll be left with just one good answer. It's easier to knock out the bad answers than it is often to spot the good answers. Okay. And this touches on where I started at the beginning. In the UK, we have a principles-based, so it's guidelines, it's guidelines and common sense and judgment, rather than a great long list of rules that covers every possible situation that could arise. So true or false? Kind of already said this one. Will they always refer to a rule book and not consider the specific situation? I don't think so. The course of action is always obvious. We'd like to think so, wouldn't we? We'd like to think so. The right thing should hopefully be obvious. I think the problem word in any true or false question, the problem word here is this one. If it said usually obvious, then in most cases it's pretty common sense. Can we think of a grey area? Situation with competing clients. Is it obvious that you shouldn't work for two clients, but then what if there isn't another good accountant in the area who knows about their particular industry? There can be cases when it's not so easy. So the problem word is always. If it said usually, maybe it would be true, but not always. There are cases when I doubt. Okay, and then many organizations introduce a code of conduct. Which three of the following are an advantage of implementing a code of conduct? So we're only looking for one that isn't. Business is more ethical. Well, that's certainly true. Reduces reputational risk. Well, I'm pretty happy with both of those statements. Ooh. It allows the business to remove staff as it supersedes the legal rights of the employee. Does anything supersede our legal rights? I like the sound of that one. Let's leave that. Employee behavior becomes more standardized and consistent. Well, without a code of conduct, every situation you've got to think about it and make it up as you go along, which hopefully most people will make reasonable decisions. But if you have a code of conduct, it's much more straightforward. You often will have a precedent of how a particular situation has been dealt with before. So yeah, more standardized, more consistent, that's pretty good. Risk of unethical behavior is reduced. Well, that's obvious, yes. Okay, so in fact, we've removed three. Well, we found the three good ones. It's pretty clear which one isn't. Quite kind of the person writing the question to tell us they were looking for three. So we really only had to find a bad one and superseding legal rights. So, okay, and at that. Last one. An audit firm has been approached by the NCA, the National Crime Agency, regarding one of their clients' financial affairs. It's been highlighted that the client may be involved. Keyword is maybe. Doesn't say the client is definitely or has been caught definitely. So do we give them the information? Yes or no? Remember the situations that we talked about? In this case, we have a legal duty. Don't know why it thinks I want to rub things out. A legal duty. So yes, indeed we should. Indeed we should. In this case, legal duty. If it said we'd been approached by the AAT regarding allegations that have been made against a fellow accountant, then that would be the professional body. And that concludes our session. Before we go further, I'll say thank you for attending tonight.